Playtime. Cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, army, they were all basically the same game with different props. If someone had a Western hat, it was cowboys and Indians. If someone had guns and green jackets, it was army. When only sticks or long cardboard tubes were available, it was time for gladiators or knights. But the imaginations of children are not limited to the correct props. It was fully acceptable to use a Western pistol as an army gun, or even a stick as a rifle. Just no cowboy hats when playing army, unless you pinned one side up and claimed to be Australian. We even used bicycles if they fit in the scenario, although they were usually only employed in cops and robbers for the chase scenes. In Winnipeg in the 1960s, there were ample spaces for the creativity of young boys. It was not unusual to walk for miles to play in a small rural forest, or at a construction site, or even at the dump. Lots of different terrains for different games. Occasionally, kids played in pairs or alone with an endless supply of imaginary enemies and comrades. There were no video games, and most children were encouraged to play outside in the fresh air. It was all about imagination and the inspiration of stories from books, or most likely, television and the movies. We all enjoyed the many movies depicting the brave actions of World War II soldiers, as well as the weekly TV action shows like Combat and Rat Patrol. Even the comedy series Hogan's Heroes, and eventually MASH, stimulated our playtime activities. Of course, every boy wanted to be John Wayne. Not just the cowboy, but also the military man, and especially the Green Beret. Comic books like Sergeant Rock, The Haunted Tank, and Sergeant Fury always seemed accessible. Every trip to the library resulted in examining the war section. A lot of fun was in the jargon. Come on, men, load up 20 rounds of ammo and get ready to go on patrol with the lieutenant. Never lieutenant, unless it was Montgomery fighting Rommel. I learned rounds was the term for bullets. Rations were food, and a latrine was a field toilet usually associated with some form of punishment for going AWOL. We were quick to correct each other when we got it wrong. We also usually picked different names and ranks to best portray the role of our chosen characters. The good guys were the Americans. That's how we viewed World War II. It was the United States Marine Corps who won the war, right? Bombarded by the US media, who would think otherwise? I had never seen a Canadian fighter aircraft or a warship. All I remember from Canadian history classes were French Canadians, voyageurs and prime ministers. I had no recollection of Canadian military participation in the wars with Germany. I knew nothing of Vimy Ridge or the liberation of Holland. Perhaps it was taught, but in some lackluster fashion that went in one ear and out the other. Contrary to what most people currently believe, Canadian youth now know much more about our military history than my generation ever did. I had never even heard the term peacekeeping, and I could not bring to mind a single Canadian war personality or regiment. Ironically, I ended up as the curator of a Canadian military museum. The bad guys were almost always the Germans or the Japanese. The Nazis had the best uniforms, awesome helmets, impressive machine guns, and the finest tanks. Anti-heroes were sometimes more fascinating than heroes. In Cops and Robbers, there would typically be a dispute over who got to be Elliot Ness and who would be Al Capone. It was no different with the war celebrities or armies. The countless victims of war, the atrocities of the German genocide, or the Japanese death marches were lost on us. In our games, it was just as much fun to be on either side of the war. One sunny afternoon, a group from our block got together to form sides for a battle scenario, where one group would defend the elevated front steps of a home while the others executed sniper fire, followed by closing in and finally assaulting the objective. Choosing teams was not difficult, and it was part of the fun of the game. The difficulty came when it was time to choose roles. Team 1 was obviously the U.S. Marines, who historically fought in every battle against all foes. At least we thought they had. Dwayne, the leader of Team 2, was older than the rest of us, having been held back 1 year in school. He announced his army would be the German SS, but was confronted by a boy named Shim, who pleaded, "Hey guys, my mom is German. The Germans can't be the bad guys." Dwayne responded, "I thought you were Japanese." Shim countered, "My dad is Japanese, but my mom is German." This caused Dwayne to strut around in frustration. "That only leaves the Italians. I don't want to be the Italians. They never win. We may as well surrender right now." This prompted Team 1 to condemn Dwayne with jokes like, "Want to buy a surplus Italian rifle? It's never been fired and only dropped once." Or how does an Italian soldier salute and then demonstrate by raising their hands to indicate giving up? There was nothing glamorous about Mussolini. Props fitting the game added to the excitement. Surplus uniforms, usually hats, toy army guns, and some burned cork or mud on the face for camouflage enhanced the game. Sometimes one kid would show up with a real relic, like a canteen used by an uncle in the war, or some binoculars painted green. Walkie-talkies, handheld radios, were cool because they provided the ability to secretly communicate and were more mobile than two cans joined with a taut string. They also complemented the situation with realistic sound. Another sound that was desirable was that of a cap gun. Cap guns were toys with working mechanisms that allowed the trigger to cock and release the hammer, making a clicking noise. These guns could also strike a tiny explosive patch on a strip of red paper, creating a realistic crack of a gunshot. This boosted the fun and incorporated the smell of burnt gunpowder to the action. It was far better than yelling, "Bang, bang, pow, pow," or "ah." And back then, prior to Star Wars, no one ever said, "Pew, pew." Later in life, I actually joined the Canadian Army and had a chance to perpetuate the war games of my childhood, but on a whole different level, and to get paid for doing so. I discovered that the real Army training was even more fun than the childhood games.